The first sound was laughter, sharp, nervous, brittle like glass about to crack. It came from the back row, where a student had tried to stifle it, but failed. Within seconds, the laughter died, replaced by silence so suffocating that even the chalk dust in the air seemed to freeze. The professor, Dr. Leonard Hayes, stood still at the podium, wrists cuffed behind his back, a white officer's hand gripping his shoulder as if he were no different than a common criminal dragged from the street. That was the moment when everything changed. In less than 5 minutes, his life, the life he had carefully built as a respected scholar, mentor, and father, had been reduced to a spectacle of humiliation before the very students he had promised to uplift. Leonard had always believed in the power of words. History, literature, law, these were the weapons he wielded to cut through ignorance. But the steel biting into his skin told him that words meant nothing here. Not against a badge. Not against a system that saw his skin before it saw his humanity. His students sat frozen, eyes wide, cell phones discreetly raised. The officer barked something about resisting and probable cause, but Leonard had resisted nothing. He had only stood his ground when another officer questioned whether the books in his bag were stolen. His books, his lecture notes, his life's work reduced to evidence in the eyes of those who believed a black man could not possibly own them. The humiliation was unbearable. A classroom was supposed to be sacred, a place of learning, curiosity, and mutual respect. Now it had become a stage for the oldest American tragedy. Leonard thought of his mother, who had scrubbed hospital floors for 30 years so her son could wear a professor's jacket. He thought of his daughter, Maya, sitting in high school at that very moment, perhaps hearing rumors on social media before she even saw him at dinner. He thought of the countless men and women before him, dragged, shackled, erased, and he wondered if this was his chapter in that same unending book. The officer shoved him forward, muttering something about sending a message. Leonard caught the eyes of one of his brightest students, a young Latina named Sophia, who had tears streaming down her face. She mouthed 2 words, "I'm sorry." He wanted to tell her she had nothing to be sorry for, that it was not her burden. But the words caught in his throat as the door closed behind him, the echo of his shame rattling the walls he had once filled with hope. Outside, the corridor was eerily empty. The second officer radioed something Leonard couldn't hear, then tightened the cuffs unnecessarily. Pain shot through his shoulders. He clenched his jaw, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a groan. In his silence, his dignity remained intact, even if his freedom had been stripped away. News traveled fast. By the time Leonard was thrown into the back of the squad car, footage of the incident had already reached thousands. The clip, 37 seconds long, captured everything. The professor's calm defiance, the officer's aggression, the collective shock of the students. Within hours, hashtags bloomed across the internet. Justice for Hayes. Teach not tossed. And perhaps most powerfully, dignity in chains. But Leonard didn't know that yet. All he knew was the sour smell of the back seat, the weight of injustice pressing down on him, and the bitter realization that no degrees, no accolades, no titles could shield him from the raw truth of America's oldest wound. At the station, the process was mechanical. Name, fingerprints, mugshot. He noticed how the officer avoided his eyes while snapping the picture, as if some part of him knew this was wrong, but did it anyway. That was the cruelty of the banality of evil, disguised in paperwork and procedure. Leonard sat in the holding cell, his mind racing. He replayed the scene over and over. His students' faces, the officer's smug expression, the sound of his own heartbeat hammering like a war drum. He thought of his lecture that morning, ironically on the Reconstruction era, when America had promised equality but delivered chains in new disguises. How fitting, he thought bitterly, that his own body now bore those same chains. History didn't just equate repeated, but history also resisted. 3 days later, Leonard stood on a stage, not behind bars. His release had come swiftly, thanks to an avalanche of public outcry. Thousands of emails flooded the university's inbox, demanding justice. Civil rights organizations picked up his case, amplifying his story. What the officers had intended as a quiet humiliation became a roar that shook the nation. The same video that captured his disgrace now revealed his strength, the way he had carried himself with unbroken dignity, the way he had not begged, not pleaded, but simply stood as a man who refused to shrink. Yet Leonard was not naive. He knew the country loved symbols more than it loved solutions. They would lift him up, use his story as a mirror, and then perhaps forget him when the news cycle turned. He wrestled with this knowledge late at night, pacing his small study, surrounded by books that suddenly felt like fragile shields. He didn't want to be a martyr. He didn't want to be anyone's hero. He only wanted to teach, to read, to guide young minds toward truth. But sometimes, history chose you. Sometimes, the fight you never asked for became the only one you could not walk away from. The first rally was small, organized by his students. They gathered on the university lawn, holding signs that read, "Our professor, our pride, and knowledge shouldn't be cuffed." Leonard watched from the steps of the library, unsure if he should speak. When the microphone was passed to him, he hesitated, feeling the weight of 1,000 expectations. Then he said the simplest truth he knew. "They thought these cuffs would silence me. But all they did was remind me that silence is no longer an option." The crowd erupted, their voices rising into the golden sky, a chorus of defiance that felt larger than the campus, larger than the moment. From there, it spread. News networks called. Journalists camped outside his home. Politicians tried to align themselves with his cause. Some did so with sincerity, others with calculation. Leonard navigated it cautiously, aware that his image was being shaped not just by his own words, but by the machinery of media and politics. He refused to let them twist his story into something neat and palatable. "This isn't about me," he told every reporter. "This is about every classroom that should be safe, every student who should never have to see their mentor humiliated, every black man who deserves to be seen as human first." Still, the attention weighed on him. Strangers recognized him at grocery stores, whispering, "That's him," as he passed. His daughter struggled with the sudden spotlight, her friends bombarding her with questions. His colleagues offered awkward condolences, some supportive, others resentful of his newfound fame. And through it all, Leonard wondered, was he truly becoming a symbol of justice, or merely another story consumed by a nation addicted to outrage? One night, unable to sleep, Leonard sat at his desk and began to write. Not lectures, not academic papers, but letters to his students, to his daughter, to the generations yet unborn. He wrote about what it felt like to have your humanity questioned in the very place you dedicated your life to. He wrote about the sting of the cuffs, the silence of the cell, the roar of the crowd. And as he wrote, he realized that the story was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced. Everyone who had ever stood in chains yet refused to bow. The days blurred into weeks. Each new protest grew larger. Universities across the country held teach-ins, where students and professors discussed systemic racism, policing, and the fragile promise of equality. Leonard was invited to speak, and though he still felt the weight of the spotlight, he accepted. At each podium, he carried the memory of that classroom to chalk dust, the frozen faces, the laughter that turned to silence. That moment of humiliation had been a crucible, burning away any illusion he still held about safety or neutrality. Out of its ashes, something stronger had emerged. And yet, even as the nation rallied, the police department doubled down. They released statements justifying the arrest, twisting facts, painting Leonard as uncooperative. They leaked selective reports to the press, hoping to smear his reputation. But the videos spoke louder than lies. His students defended him passionately, their testimonies unwavering. For once, the truth did not buckle under pressure. It grew louder. In quiet moments, Leonard still felt the sting of that day. Trauma had a way of lingering, like a shadow you could never quite shake. But alongside the pain came something else, purpose. He began to see himself not as a victim, but as a vessel carrying the voices of those who had come before, those who had suffered in silence, those who had fought and bled so that he could stand in the light. The golden light. That was how he remembered it. The way the sun had poured through the windows that morning, casting long beams across the chalkboard as the cuffs clicked shut. It was strange, almost cruel, how beauty and brutality could coexist in the same moment. But perhaps that was the essence of the struggle, finding the light, even when darkness pressed close. And now, as he stood before crowds, as he spoke into microphones, as he became a reluctant symbol of justice, he carried that light with him. It was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone who refused to bow, who refused to be silenced, who refused to let chains define them. And so, the story of Dr. Leonard Hayes, the professor who had been humiliated before his students, became something more. It became a story of resilience, of resistance, of justice. A story that reminded a nation that even in its darkest moments, light could break through, and when it did, it turned victims into symbols, and symbols into movements. Leonard had never liked microphones. Their cold metal, the way they distorted his voice, made him feel like he was speaking through a filter, his humanity reduced to static. But now, microphones seemed to follow him everywhere. In auditoriums, on courthouse steps, at candlelight vigils. They demanded words, demanded he become more than what he felt ready to be. He often wondered if this was how leaders were made, not by choice, but by circumstance. One afternoon, just a week after the incident, he sat in a crowded community hall. The smell of fried chicken and collard greens wafted in from the kitchen, mingling with the sharp scent of coffee brewing in large urns. Elders from the neighborhood sat in the front row, their faces lined with wisdom and fatigue. Younger activists filled the aisles, their energy palpable, their phones already recording. When Leonard was introduced, the applause was thunderous. He rose slowly, adjusting the glasses that had slipped slightly down his nose, and approached the podium. "I was a professor," he began, his voice steady but soft. "A man who loved books more than microphones. I wanted my battles to stay in the classroom, on chalkboards, and in essays. But sometimes, life chooses a stage for you. And when it does, you don't get to walk away." The crowd leaned forward. Some nodded. Others whispered affirmations under their breath. "They dragged me from my classroom in front of my students. They wanted to humiliate me. But I tell you, this humiliation can be a seed. Plant it in the soil of truth, water it with courage, and watch what grows." The room erupted, chants rising. "Justice now. Justice now." Leonard stepped back, his chest heaving. He hadn't planned those words. They had spilled from him like water bursting through a dam. For the first time since his arrest, he felt not only heard, but understood. As the weeks unfolded, his schedule grew relentless. Interviews at dawn, meetings with lawyers at noon, speaking engagements at night. The university, caught in the storm, issued carefully crafted statements about commitments to diversity and ongoing investigations. But Leonard could see the discomfort in the eyes of some administrators. He was no longer just their professor. He was a spotlight they hadn't asked for. Some colleagues congratulated him in private, their voices hushed, as if supporting him was dangerous. Others distanced themselves, fearing association. It stung, but he understood. Courage was never evenly distributed. What sustained him most were his students. They organized reading circles around his house, bringing copies of Baldwin, Morrison, and Du Bois. They marched with signs that bore his face. They flooded social media with testimonies of his mentorship. For them, Leonard wasn't just a professor, was proof that intellect and dignity could survive even the most brutal attempts to erase them. Still, the weight was immense. Nights found him staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment the cuffs clicked shut. Trauma has a way of replaying itself like a broken record, sharp and inescapable. His daughter, Maya, often crept into his study, sitting beside him quietly until he took her hand. Once she asked, "Daddy, why did they do that to you?" He struggled for words, searching for an answer that wouldn't shatter her faith in the world. Finally, he said, "Because sometimes people choose not to see the truth. But that doesn't mean we stop showing it to them." Maya's eyes filled with tears. "Will they do it again?" she whispered. Leonard pulled her into his arms, his heart breaking at the fear in her voice. "Not if we keep fighting," he promised, though he wasn't sure promises were enough. By the second month, his case had become a national flashpoint. Civil rights attorneys filed lawsuits. Community leaders demanded accountability. Politicians appeared at rallies, their speeches dripping with opportunism. Leonard remained wary. He had studied history long enough to know that movements were often co-opted, twisted into slogans without substance. He resolved that his story would not be used as decoration. It had to mean something deeper. One turning point came when he was invited to testify before a state legislative hearing on police reform. The chamber was cold, its walls lined with portraits of men long dead. Leonard took his seat, feeling the eyes of lawmakers upon him. Cameras flashed. He could almost hear the nation holding its breath. "I was handcuffed for teaching," he said, his voice carrying across the marble hall. Not for stealing, not for violence, not for crime, but for teaching. Let that sink in. A black professor in America was treated as a suspect for holding his own books in his own classroom. If that doesn't tell you something about the disease in our system, nothing will. He described the fear in his students' eyes, the ache in his wrists, the silence of administrators. He spoke not just for himself, but for countless others who never got a microphone. When he finished, the room was silent. Not the silence of indifference, but the silence that comes when truth leaves no room for argument. Outside, crowds waited. When he emerged, chants swelled. Hayes! 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 Reporters swarmed, thrusting microphones forward. He answered what he could, but his mind was already elsewhere. He thought of his mother again, her weary hands scrubbing floors, and how she used to whisper, "Baby, don't let them tell you what you can't be." In that moment, he felt her presence beside him, as if she had walked with him into that chamber, carrying generations of resilience. But fame was a double-edged sword. For every supporter, there were detractors. Anonymous threats filled his inbox. Right-wing commentators painted him as a race baiter, twisting his story into fuel for their audience. Some accused him of staging the incident for attention. Leonard learned quickly that to stand for justice was to invite venom, but he refused to shrink. He had already been humiliated once. He would not let fear silence him again. Meanwhile, his students continued to push the movement forward. They organized a nationwide day of action, urging classrooms across the country to pause and discuss systemic racism. Photos poured in from schools in New York, Chicago, Atlanta, Los Angeles, students holding signs that read, "We are all Professor Hayes." For Leonard, it was both humbling and overwhelming. His private humiliation had become a public demand for change. Yet amid the whirlwind, he remained haunted by one question. What comes after the rallies? He had seen movements flare brightly only to fade when the cameras left. He wanted something lasting, something that would outlive him. Late one night, sitting in his study surrounded by stacks of papers, Leonard began drafting a proposal for a National Institute on Racial Justice in Education. His idea was simple but radical: to create a space where stories like his could be studied, where data and testimonies could fuel policy, where students could learn not just history but the tools to dismantle oppression. He poured his vision onto the page, line after line, his fatigue forgotten. By dawn, he had a blueprint. He shared it first with his students, who responded with tears and applause. Then he sent it to lawyers, community leaders, and eventually sympathetic lawmakers. Momentum gathered. What had begun as a single act of humiliation was evolving into a movement with roots. Still, the fight was far from over. The police department refused to apologize. The officers involved remained on duty. Each hearing, each press conference, each protest reminded Leonard that justice in America was not won overnight. It was carved slowly, painfully, out of stone. But something had shifted. The nation had seen the video. They had heard his words. They had witnessed not just injustice, but dignity in the face of it. That image, the professor standing tall despite the cuffs, had etched itself into the collective conscience. And Leonard knew that once people saw, truly saw, they could not unsee. As spring turned to summer, Leonard traveled more frequently. He visited colleges, community centers, churches. In each place, he encountered people who told him their own stories of humiliation, discrimination, erasure. He listened, nodded, sometimes wept with them. He realized that his role was not to speak for them, but to remind them that their voices mattered too. In quiet moments, he still wrestled with doubt. He wondered if he was strong enough to bear the weight of so many hopes. But then he remembered his classroom, the golden light streaming across the chalkboard, the eyes of his students fixed on him. He remembered the silence after the laughter, the silence that demanded courage. And he knew this was his calling, whether he wanted it or not. The day he returned to his classroom for the first time since the arrest, the hallway was packed. Students lined the walls, holding signs that read, "Welcome back," and "Our professor, our fighter." Leonard walked slowly, his heart pounding, until he reached the door. Inside, the chalkboard still bore the faint outline of the last lecture he had given. He stood for a long moment, then picked up a piece of chalk. His hand trembled, but he steadied it. On the board, he wrote one word: justice. The room erupted in applause, But Leonard raised a hand for silence. This, he said softly, pointing to the word, is not just a concept. It's a demand. It's what you deserve. It's what every person deserves. And it's what they tried to take from us that day. But here we are. And here we will stay. The golden light poured in again, filling the room with warmth. This time, it felt like blessing. The word justice stayed on the board for weeks. Students refused to erase it, even when new lectures began. It became more than chalk. It was a banner, a shield, a reminder of the line they refused to let be crossed again. Leonard noticed how students lingered longer after class now, not just to ask about assignments, but to talk about life, fear, resilience. The classroom had become something larger than itself, a place where survival and scholarship merged. Yet outside those walls, the battle raged on. Leonard's lawsuit against the department moved slowly, tangled in motions, hearings, and bureaucratic stalling tactics. The officers remained on the force, their names shielded by union lawyers who framed the incident as a misunderstanding. Leonard bristled every time he heard that word. Misunderstanding implied an accident. But this had not been accidental. It had been deliberate. He knew it. His students knew it. The world had seen it. One morning, he received a call from a civil rights leader he had admired since childhood. The man's voice was gravelly, tired, but still fierce. "Brother Hayes," he said, "they tried to break you, but you became the story they couldn't bury. Don't waste this. Use it." That advice burned in Leonard's chest for days. He began accepting more invitations to speak, though exhaustion gnawed at him. He stood in gymnasiums, cathedrals, outdoor parks where crowds swelled into the thousands. Each time, he felt the strange duality of being both himself and something more, a symbol, a vessel for a movement that was bigger than one man. At one rally in Atlanta, the heat pressed heavy and sweat streaked his shirt. He stood at the podium, gripping the edges until his knuckles whitened. The crowd chanted his name, but he raised a hand to silence them. "Don't say my name," he said, voice trembling with intensity. "Say the names of those we've lost. Say the names of those who never got to stand here, who never got to tell their story." Voices erupted, calling out names, each syllable hanging in the hot air like a prayer. Leonard felt tears sting his eyes. In that moment, he knew the movement had grown beyond him. He was not its leader. He was its witness. Silence was no longer an option. His proposal for the National Institute gained traction. Universities expressed interest, philanthropists pledged funds. Meetings were set with senators, with education boards, with foundations eager to attach their names to something meaningful. Still, Leonard remained cautious. Money and politics had a way of bending noble causes into hollow gestures. He insisted the institute be led by students and scholars of color, rooted in community rather than prestige. "If this becomes just another museum piece," he told one donor, "then we've failed before we've begun." Meanwhile, the legal battle reached a turning point. The video, now analyzed frame by frame, left little room for the department's narrative. Expert witnesses testified, scholars submitted briefs, students gave statements. Leonard sat in court, his stomach knotted, as his humiliation was replayed on giant screens. Each time, the sound of the cuffs echoed through the room, a reminder of the day his life had cracked open. Yet he refused to look away. If he could endure it once, he could endure it again for the sake of truth. When his turn came to testify, the courtroom hushed. He stood, adjusting his jacket, his voice steady. "I am not here to destroy anyone," he began. "I am here because I want no one else to endure what I endured. I want no child to see their teacher chained. I want no man or woman to feel like their skin makes them suspect in their own space." He paused, scanning the faces of the jury, the judge, the spectators. This is not about revenge. It is about justice. And justice, if it is real, must be for everyone. Reporters scribbled furiously. The clip aired that night, and once again the nation listened. Some applauded, others sneered. But no one ignored it. As weeks turned to months, Leonard found himself caught between exhaustion and purpose. He longed for ordinary days, for quiet mornings with coffee and books. Yet every time he considered retreat, another letter arrived, a student thanking him for inspiring them to study law, a mother sharing her son's story of harassment, an elder recalling battles fought decades earlier. These voices braided into his spirit, reminding him that the fight was never just his. One particularly heavy night, Leonard sat on the porch with his daughter. The cicadas hummed in the trees, the summer air thick with humidity. Maya leaned against him, her voice small. "Daddy, are you scared?" Leonard hesitated. "Yes," he admitted. "But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward even when fear walks beside you." She nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "Then I think you're the bravest man I know." Tears filled Leonard's eyes. In that simple declaration, he found strength renewed. The following month, he was invited to deliver a keynote address at a national conference on racial justice. Thousands filled the auditorium, the lights bright, the air buzzing with anticipation. Leonard stepped onto the stage, his heart pounding. He thought of his classroom, of chalk dust and golden beams of light, and began, "I was humiliated in front of my students. But humiliation, I learned, is not the end. It is the beginning. They put chains on my wrists, but they could not chain my mind, my spirit, or my dignity. And now I stand here not as a victim, but as a witness to the power of truth." Applause thundered, but Leonard pressed on. The question is not whether injustice exists. We know it does. The question is, what will we do about it? Will we look away, or will we face it head on, with courage, with solidarity, with love fierce enough to change the world? The crowd rose, chanting, clapping, shouting. Leonard felt the weight of history in that moment, the sacrifices of those who had marched before, the hope of those who would march after. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps real change was possible. Yet he knew the fight was far from over. Institutions did not crumble overnight. Systems of oppression did not dissolve with speeches. But he also knew this. Once a story takes root in the hearts of people, it cannot be uprooted easily. And his story, born in humiliation, carried by resilience, and lifted by a nation's conscience, was now woven into the fabric of justice itself. He walked off the stage, the roar of the crowd behind him, and whispered to himself, "The work continues." And it did. In classrooms, in courthouses, in streets where protest chants echoed into the night. The work continued, carried by voices louder and more numerous than his own. Leonard Hayes was no longer just a professor. He was a reminder that dignity can survive chains, that truth can outshine lies, that justice, though delayed, is never fully denied. And somewhere deep in his soul, he felt the golden light again, warm, unyielding, eternal. The golden light seemed to follow him now, or perhaps he had simply learned to notice it more. In airports, on sidewalks, even in the sterile fluorescent glow of government buildings, Leonard could sense its warmth breaking through the shadows. It was not just sunlight. It was resilience itself, a reminder that even in the darkest corners, something pure could shine through. The trial of the officers began 6 months after his arrest. By then, Leonard's face was familiar to millions. News outlets branded him the Professor of Justice, a title that both humbled and unsettled him. He did not want to be reduced to a slogan, but he knew how stories worked. People needed symbols, something tangible to hold on to in the chaos of a broken system. The courthouse was ringed with barricades and cameras. Protesters and supporters crowded the steps, chanting slogans. Inside, the air buzzed with tension. Leonard sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly as the officers entered. They avoided his eyes. He studied their faces, searching for any sign of remorse, but found only arrogance and stone. The trial stretched on for weeks. Lawyers clashed over evidence. Videos replayed endlessly. Experts debated policy and procedure. The officer's defense leaned on tired narratives. He looked suspicious. He failed to comply. "We acted on instinct." Leonard listened silently, his jaw clenched. Each word felt like a blade, slicing away at truth. But when his turn came to testify again, he spoke not with anger, but with clarity. "They say I looked suspicious," he told the jury, his voice calm but firm. But what did they really see? A man with a bag of books? Or a black man who, in their eyes, could not possibly belong in a classroom of authority? That is the disease we face, not individual bad choices, but a system that trains people to see color as threat. And until we confront that, we will repeat this cycle again and again. The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge leaned forward, listening. Leonard continued, "I do not stand here to punish these men. I stand here because I want my daughter to grow up in a country where her worth is not questioned by the color of her skin, where classrooms are places of safety, not stages of humiliation, where justice is not a dream but a daily practice. The closing arguments came, heavy with rhetoric. Then the jury deliberated. Hours felt like lifetimes. Leonard sat outside the chamber, staring at the floor, trying to quiet his racing thoughts. His students surrounded him, offering hugs, whispered prayers, their presence a balm. Finally, the verdict came. Guilty on charges of misconduct, abuse of power, and false arrest. The officers would lose their badges, face fines, and in one case, serve time. The courtroom erupted cheers, tears, chants. Leonard sat motionless, his heart pounding. He had braced for disappointment, for the all-too-familiar outcome of no accountability. But this time, justice had cracked through the stone. Not fully, not completely, but enough to matter. Outside, reporters swarmed him. Microphones pressed forward. "Professor Hayes, how do you feel?" He paused, searching for words. "Relieved," he said finally. But also reminded, this is not the end. This is one step. Justice is not a single verdict, it is the work we carry every day. Let us not confuse accountability with victory. There is more to be done. His words echoed across the nation, broadcast on every channel. That night, candlelight vigils were held in dozens of cities. People carried signs that read, "Dignity in chains, justice for all, we are not suspicious." Leonard watched the coverage from his living room, Maya curled up beside him. Tears slid silently down his cheeks. Not tears of triumph, but of release, of carrying a weight too heavy for too long. In the weeks that followed, his proposal for the National Institute was officially approved. Universities pledged land, donors pledged funds, students pledged energy. The Institute for Justice in Education was born, with Leonard as its founding director. Its mission was clear: to research, to teach, to advocate, to ensure no one's dignity would be shackled in silence again. Opening day arrived with thousands gathered. The building gleamed in the sunlight, its glass walls reflecting the sky. Leonard stood at the podium, his heart swelling as he looked out at students, activists, elders, children. He spoke with steady conviction. This institute is not about me. It is about us. It is about every voice that has been silenced, every life diminished by injustice, every dream deferred by prejudice. Today, we reclaim those dreams. Today, we build something that will outlast us all. Applause thundered. Students cheered, elders wept, activists raised fists. Leonard felt the golden light pour through the windows, bathing the room in warmth. He knew then that the humiliation he endured had not been in vain. It had been the spark. And from that spark, a fire had been lit. As the institute grew, Leonard returned often to his classroom. He refused to give up teaching. No matter how many speeches he gave or policies he shaped, his truest calling remained with the students, with chalkboards and books, with the sacred space of learning. And every semester, on the first day of class, he wrote one word on the board: justice. Years passed. The institute became a national force, influencing laws, shaping curricula, inspiring new generations of leaders. Leonard grew older, his hair silvering, his steps slower. But his spirit burned just as brightly. Maya, now a young lawyer, worked alongside him, carrying the torch. Together, they traveled the country, father and daughter, speaking not just of pain but of possibility. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Leonard walked alone through the empty halls of the institute. The sun was setting, casting golden beams through the glass, painting the walls with light. He paused before a mural created by students, a towering image of him standing in front of a chalkboard, cuffs on his wrists, but eyes blazing with dignity. Above it, in bold letters, was the word that had followed him all these years: justice. He stood there a long time, tears welling. He thought of his mother's weary hands, of Maya's frightened voice, of Sophia's whispered, "I'm sorry." He thought of the officers, of the courtroom, of the nights filled with fear. He thought of every person who had carried him, supported him, believed in him. And he whispered softly, "We did it. Not everything. Not enough. But something. Something real." The golden light bathed his face, warm and eternal. And with that, Dr. Leonard Hayes, the professor once humiliated before his students, closed his eyes, and let the weight of his journey rest, knowing he had not only endured but transformed, knowing that he had become, against all odds, a national symbol of justice, not because he sought it, not because he wanted it, but because history had demanded it, and he had answered. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.